What is the dumbest way you have ever gotten laid? I had an insanely cute girl who I knew from high school come up to me recently and ask me for my number. This girl was gorgeous, so I spent the next few days furiously rubbing one out 3 times a day to the thought of me and her. Throughout these few days, we talked a lot. Things seemed to be going super, and she eventually invited me over to her house to hang out. Oh yeah, it was time to finally lose my V-card to an absolute 10. The day came around and I made sure to dress nice, smell good, wash away all the cheese that had built up on my PP as a result of jacking it 4 times a day for a week, and apply cologne. I got to the house ready to do my thing. She invited me and she was home alone. Not going to lie, as soon as she hugged me I got a stiffy. We sat down on her couch and started talking, and I thought we were both getting casual conversation out of the way before we got to banging. Oh, how wrong I was. A few minutes into talking, the doorbell rings. My heart stops as I think her parents are back. However, calmly she stands up and tells me she invited one of her girlfriends over too. Now I was excited. I thought I was about to have a 3-way with 2 beautiful girls. However, tragedy strikes. The cute girl comes back, and in behind her comes in an absolute beluga. A whale so massive I wasn't sure what I was looking at. I try my best to hide the shock and horror from my face. No way am I going to have a 3-way which will end in me suffocating in between belly rolls. Without much thought, the cute girl goes to me, Jack, here is my friend Chloe. She saw a picture of you and thought you were cute, so I set you 2 up on a surprise date. I'll leave you 2 alone. Without me having time to process it, the cute girl bolts upstairs, leaving me and this monstrosity alone in the living room. I do my best to hide my disappointment, and try make conversation with this wildebeest. Well, the wildebeest had brought alcohol, and it was consumed by us too. After many shots, Chloe's rolls started to look appetizing. In an inebriated state, I decided F it, I have made it this far, might as well do it, and me and the beluga proceeded to have intoxicated sweaty intimacy on the cute girl's couch. All while the cute girl was upstairs. After I was done, even through the alcohol, post-nut clarity consumed every fiber of my being. I felt like throwing up. Staring at her kebab womanhood, experiencing post-nut and on booze, made me sick. I darted upstairs to tell the cute girl I was leaving, and didn't even say goodbye to the beluga on the way out. The walk to my house was about 40 minutes, and I threw up during it. When did playing hide and seek go wrong on Halloween? My husband Jim and I own an antique business in a big old bizarre barn of a building. 5 floors. Multiple other tenants, including a restaurant. Halloween was a Monday last year. We locked up the business at 5 p.m., and we went to an early dinner across town. Then we got a call from Sonatrol, our security monitoring company, at 6:30. A motion detector on the lower level. Then another. We left in a tearing hurry but figured. It's a bird. Or a rat. We don't have rats, but you know, something. Maybe a cat. It's way too early for a break-in, after all. I went inside the main level upstairs and disarmed the alarm, and started fumbling noisily with the keys and the big iron gate, one of many that separate the floors at night. Jim checked the perimeter outside for signs of a break-in. Nothing, doors and windows are intact. Definitely, absolutely a bird. Or a rat. Or a cat. Dusk was long gone. The shadows had settled in and taken over. Just wardrobes loomed in the dark. Wardrobes and nothing more. Right? I headed down below to the location of the alarm, trusting Jim would follow. After all, it was a rat. Or a cat. Or a bird. I am accustomed to the building after dark, so I just turned on my phone light, not the overheads, and walked around boldly like I owned the place. I looked in the corner with the motion detector. Nothing, just its red eye blinking mindlessly at me. No rats, no cats, no birds. I turned and went the other way while Jim poked around a few aisles over. And there it was. A effing burglary kit sitting in the middle of the floor. Bolt cutters, and a fire extinguisher, just sitting there, waiting. I have never gotten a bigger case of sheer terror so fast. After all, there was no broken window or door. So he was still there. In the dark. With me. I hissed Jim, please, 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 and he didn't hear me. I literally couldn't scream, just like in those stupid goddamn dreams, my voice stuck. Just me, the spotlit burglary tools, and a hostile presence lurking in the dusty shadows watching while I whispered for someone to save me. Finally 1,000 years or maybe 10 seconds later Jim wondered why I had taken root in the hallway and came to see. He saw what I was frozen pointing at and was like, oh F. We bolted out the front door to call 911 and wait. And we abandoned the building to the burglar. An eternal 5 minutes later, the police showed up and were initially pretty unimpressed with our find of the crowbar and fire extinguisher. Until we pulled up the security footage that revealed the actual horror. The face of my new sleep paralysis demon. So, this guy. As is obvious, he is built like a lean, mean brick sh-thous. He'd crouched on a landing behind a bookcase when we closed and watched me and my staff lock up. Bided his time. Then calm as could be, he walked out and went to the men's restroom in the hallway downstairs. That area isn't set for motion detection for a variety of reasons. He spent a while in there, moving around with the door open. He constructed the mask using one of ours and a fake flower wreath to hold it on. Purple plastic clematis. He looked right into the camera barefaced, and then put the mask on, stared at it fixedly in his mask for a time, and finally pulled his gloves on. He stacked a few solid-body vintage suitcases in front of a tall iron gate and hopped right over like it was nothing. He ran down the hall and looped the floor. He ran back into the hall and moved the ladder to hop back to the other side of the gate and, Bizarrely, just repeated this whole thing a few times. Then he went to the basement. Wormed over a 15-inch gap over yet another iron gate. Back to the hall again. Stared into the camera more. Repeat. He was moving fast up and over, back and forth, upstairs and downstairs. Parkour style almost. Then he got the tools out and peeled apart one of our steel lock boxes with the crowbar, and stole a handful of our keys to access showcases. At this point, he heard me fumbling with the gate and keys upstairs. He ditched the stolen keys and tools and hid, watching me while he waited in the dark. We exited to call 911, and he ran back to the basement. In the basement, there is access to a dirt tunnel that circles the perimeter of the building. He broke the door open and entered. Spiders the size of dinner plates live in there. He had no light. It's muddy and dank. It's, in a word, petrifying. There is a tiny exit hatch, if you walk the whole thing and take the multiple turns, that dumps you into the busy kitchen of a restaurant, whereupon one would need to stroll past the line cooks, out into the restaurant proper, and then one could leave their front door. Plastered with mud, which does leave tracks. Speaking from experience. When we found it, there was a clear entrance into the tunnel but no exit tracks. No muddy footprints, nobody was walking out on the restaurant cameras, and the cooks noticed nothing. Reviewing the footage, timing it all, tracing his path from camera to camera, and searching the building carefully took hours. By the end, all of us, including the police, were starting to lose our collective cool and freak out. There was no chill when even the guys with guns were rattled. After all, where the F did he go? Jim and the two officers had no choice but to walk the dirt tunnel. The cops took one look and were like, absolutely not, Jim insisted, and so they made him walk point. They made it about half the tunnel before the cops were like, F no, you are leaving with us, and we are gonna review more footage from the restaurant where there are no spiders and F this. Jim got the okay from them to board up both ends of the tunnel. Which he did solidly. And thus, the story ends. The pictures got spread widely, but we got no useful leads despite the decent face shot. Did he indeed crawl out a hatch in the busy kitchen and stroll out past the cooks, leaving no trace of mud? I guess. We got no suspicious smells coming out of the tunnel in later weeks and months. We only unboarded the tunnel last week for the split water main shenanigans. I have vowed I will use his skull in this year's Halloween display if he's dead down there. Women, what scary lesson about online texting did you learn as a kid? America Online was a big thing when I was 13, or in other words, for my generation, AIM. Which stood for AOL Instant Messenger. It was around 2002, and I would have been a fresh 13 and in 8th grade. I had many times gone into chat rooms by myself or with friends goofing around. Unfortunately, unsolicited photos were a thing then, too, but usually, you could stay clear of it by the chat room you entered. I didn't have any photos of myself, and back then, you had to take a digital photo and upload it from your camera. Plus, I was 13 and self-conscious, which I'm sure anyone can relate to. But one day, a guy popped up on my screen, wanting to chat. It went fine at first. I was very naive back then, and we quickly fell into a pattern of talking. His name was Dave, and he lived in California. Eventually, him telling me he loved me, etc., but the problem was he was 19. Now I wasn't proud of this, but at first, being 13, I just sent pictures of some random girl and said it was me. He instantly fell for me, telling me age was just a number and how mature I was. Now at this point, he did not live in the state, so there was never any chance of our meeting. Eventually, he told me he and his mom were moving up to a city that was about an hour and a half away from me. He started begging me to see him and go to a movie. Anything. I had to break the catfishing truth and say those were not pictures of me but of someone else. He was furious. He had been looking forward to a different type of child this whole time. Dave forgave me a few days later, saying, I still want to meet you because I love you. All the things you say to a young girl to get her to swoon. I think back, and I'm like, wow, I was 13. So I told my best friend everything I just explained above and that I wanted her to go with me to meet him. There was a whole plan about him driving to see me and going to the movies to finally meet what I thought was the love of my life. I had been brainwashed into believing this was normal. I didn't tell my mom, of course, and honestly, she didn't notice any of it was going on, to begin with. So the day my friend and I were going to meet up with Dave, her mom came and picked us up from school. She said something that made my stomach drop into nothingness. She said, Chrissy, you are not going to the movies. You are not going to meet that man. You are going to get seriously hurt or kidnapped, and I can't allow you guys to go. I cried and cried because I honestly thought I could handle everything and be fine. She told me she wasn't going to tell my mom. I had to promise to never speak to him again and never plan to meet a stranger online. He ended up showing up and was upset I wasn't there. He went on AIM, flying off the handle like I hadn't seen at that age. It scared me. It scared me how close I was to this man being near me. I never talked to Dave again. But I easily believe I would have been kidnapped or worse that day if my best friend's mom hadn't stepped in. My mom would have been none the wiser. I was none the wiser. But I am here today and learned a dire lesson. What is the creepiest stalking experience you had? I was in my early 20s and living at home while attending graduate school. I was dropped off at home at night after a date with the man who later became my husband. My parents were in the living room with my older brother Eric, and I went upstairs to hang out with my two younger sisters, Sarah and Laura, in their shared room. The three of us, I'm sure, were talking about my date and the other sisters' gossip when suddenly there was a thump-like noise at the window. Sarah and I heard the noise but didn't really pay attention to it, but Laura was closer to the window, walked up to it, and opened the blinds. Suddenly she screamed, and we saw why when Sarah and I looked at her in the window. Staring back at us through the window was a man's face. On the second floor of the house, no less. Seeing this man, Sarah and I both screamed as well, and the three of us ran out of the room and sprinted downstairs, screaming there was a man in our window. My dad immediately ran outside, alone since my brother Eric had some leg injury and was in a brace or cast and was unable to join him. After a few minutes, my dad returned and told us he didn't see the man or anyone at all, but there was a ladder on its side right under my sister's bedroom window. My dad called the police, who came pretty quickly and searched the area themselves. They didn't find much, though they did notice footprints leading into woods behind our backyard. Unfortunately, they couldn't do anything else to find him, though they did patrol the area for a while. Since it all happened so fast and the three of us ran out of the room right away, we didn't get a good look at the man, not to mention it was dark out. Thankfully though, we never saw him again. However, about 15 years later, I was now married, had 3 kids, and lived in a house not even 10 minutes from where I grew up. I worked as a nurse in a hospital, and one day there was a horrible snowstorm. The roads were awful, and cars were snowed in. A coworker and I didn't feel safe driving, so we got a ride with another coworker whose husband was picking her up and had a nice van that was better for driving in the snow. Not far from my first coworker's house, we saw an older man walking alone who looked like he was in his late 60s. Our driver pulled up and asked if he was okay, and the man said his car was stuck or something in the snow, so he just decided to walk home since it was just about a mile away, if that. We offered him a ride nicely since it was so close, which he accepted. When asked where he lived, it ended up being the very same street I grew up on, a bit of a way down the road since it was a long road, but still effectively neighbors. I commented on this, saying how I grew up there and my parents sold the house a few years earlier. He asked which house exactly, and I told him. He looked at me and said, "You lived at 4X? Wasn't that the house with a man looking in the window?" Taken aback, I said it was. He replied, "Oh yes. I remember reading about it in the newspaper." It was never in the newspaper. I already knew that, but I even checked with my parents later that evening to be sure. The man looking in our window was never in the newspaper or on the news. My feeling is this man was the peeping Tom. The man we were giving a ride home was the same man I saw staring into our window 15 years ago. Obviously, that could be considered quite the leap to make, but hear me out. First of all, it wasn't in the newspaper. That was not true. While it's possible this man misunderstood how he heard about the story and assumed it was in the paper, I don't buy that. While it was extremely creepy and memorable to me and my family, was it that memorable for a neighbor quite a few houses down to have it be the first thing he recalled about the house 15 years later? I don't think so. There wasn't any yelling or screaming outside of the house. There was no noise like a gunshot or fighting. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was arrested or even accused. The only thing that would potentially be memorable for a neighbor was the police being called. And even then, all they did was walk around. They didn't chase after the man or bang down a door. And again, this man in the car didn't live next door. Maybe he'd see flashing lights from his house, but that's really it. So yeah, I'm 100% convinced this man was the same in our window all those years ago. I think my saying that's where I lived at the time gave him some sick pleasure, remembering what he did, and he wanted to see my reaction. Thankfully, I didn't have much of one since I was so surprised he brought it up. After he said he read it in the newspaper, my only response was, "Oh really?" That was it. We thankfully reached his house a minute or two later, and that was the last time I ever saw him. I wish I could say I confronted him on the story not being in the paper and pressed him, but I didn't. The thoughts I now have obviously didn't come to me in the very short time we were together in that car. But after thinking about it later and talking to my parents, I was convinced. I asked my dad if he knew the guy at all, and all he really knew was the guy's name and he was married, at least when we lived on that street. Obviously, we couldn't exactly do anything about it. However, my dad and brother would say they'd like to go confront him about it. Now all these years later, it's something my siblings and I will occasionally talk about and even laugh about a little bit, like teasing my brother about being unable to go look for him. Though it doesn't change the fact that it was a genuinely terrifying night. My sister Laura, who opened the blinds and was essentially face to face with him, still pins her curtains shut at night, keeps her blinds closed at night, and refuses to look out the window when it's late. And even writing this over 35 years later gives me a bit of a chill, especially talking to the man in the car 15 years later. If I'm right and he was the creep, how often did he watch us through the window? Was it the only time, or just the final time? I won't say I'm happy he's no longer alive since, as sure as I am, I can't really know it was him for a fact. But I certainly don't feel sad about it, either.